Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. Stephen Boyce. And today we'll be discussing Bishop Ignatius of Antioch and his letters, when the letters date. And before I continue, the Stephen's YouTube channel facts will be linked, is tagged in the description below. Facts of Stephen Boyce is tagged in the description below. The link will also be posted as a pinned comment below the description of the video when the live stream is over. And that being said, Stephen, thanks again for joining me once again.
Yeah, good to be on. Always enjoy your company and discussions. And this is a fun one for me. One I spent a lot of time on early on in academic life, but last year I spent a lot of time studying before writing on it again this year. Had a good time doing it.
What is the middle recension of Ignatius, and why do the majority of scholars currently hold that this is the more likely genuine version of his letters?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we're kind of at a point where there was just two recensions that people were talking about. What's today the middle recension used to be the shorter recension back when there was a discussion in the 19th century, especially when you're looking at Lightfoot, Dr. Lightfoot, an Anglican scholar who probably championed the discussion here. But it became a third category not long ago, and it's actually popularized that the shorter recension is no longer what was the short recension in the past, which is today's middle, but that there's even shorter than that coming from the Syriac tradition of the writings. So one of the discussions that's being had today is, should we follow the middle recension, which is 7 letters, which has a smaller amount of words than the long recension that became prominent, especially during the Reformation period and so forth. Then we have these Syriac manuscripts that are discovered that only have 3 letters, and they're kind of spread into these Syriac writings. There's only 3 letters that are ascribed to him, and they are even shorter than the middle recension as far as words, verses, and content. So one of the main goals that scholarship has looked at is, what kind of redactions are we dealing with? Which one is more likely to add or subtract? And so what's happened is the middle recension has still made the mainline position, but we're actually seeing a shorter recension shift where scholars are hitching themselves to that perspective. And in fact, I have good friends like Dr. Jack Bull, and I think he's been on here with us as well, having this discussion.
Yes.
And one of the things that he's an advocate for, as well as a lot of those in England, is that there's a push to go to a short recension with only 3 letters that are shorter. Particularly the letter of Romans is probably the most popular that everybody's talking about. And then you also have to deal with the letter to Polycarp, which is really, really important, because now you have 2 men who are alleged to have been with apostles, specifically John, who are corresponding back and forth about what's happening. So it's a big discussion. There's a lot of good conversations happening right now. I still fight for the middle recension, even though I have friends who have started to deviate to the short recension. But it's interesting. There was only 2 to talk about once upon a time. Now we're having the discussion of 3. You have a short, a middle, and a long. No one really, there's very, very few people that think the long recension is authentic. Not only does it have more letters, but it also has larger content. And in that content, it's extremely pious, very pious language, a lot of elongated explanations. You can tell there's a lot of interpolations in places where the writing changes, and then it goes back to what seemed to be normal. So there's a lot to talk about in those discussions too with the long recension, but hardly anybody would hold that to be authentic.
Before we continue, could you remind the audience real quick, who is Bishop Ignatius of Antioch, for those that don't know?
Sure. So Ignatius of Antioch was a disciple of possibly more than one apostle. He certainly had some sort of connection to the apostle John, but he is in the succession line between Peter and Antioch. So St. Peter and Antioch. Then you had another bishop after him named Evodius. And then after Evodius comes Ignatius. So Ignatius is a legend of a martyr who went from Antioch. He was dragged by Roman officials, similar to kind of like a Pauline imprisonment, where he was taken from one location through the Roman road all the way into Rome. And it is stated in not only his letters that he believed he was going to be killed in the Colosseum by wild animals, but it is also alleged very clearly in a document called the Martyrdom of Ignatius. And then there's also reference to it in Polycarp's letter to the Philippians, that he was taken for his Christian faith to the Colosseum somewhere between, in my opinion, the years 107 and 117. Some would like to put it in the Hadrian line later in the 2nd century. I don't think there's good men that have that position, but I don't think their arguments are the best. We have John Malalas, who puts it a little bit later than, say, Eusebius. Eusebius has it around the year 107. Malalas has a little bit later, could be around 110, 112, maybe even as late as 117, depending on how you're reading him. I seem to lean more with Malalas on it, but there's a lot of good discussion there as well. But he is a bishop. He's a leader in the Church of Antioch under St. Peter, a companion of Polycarp. We have a letter from him to Polycarp. We have Polycarp in his letter to Philippians referencing his conversations and correspondence with Ignatius. So he's an important church figure. He wouldn't have been that important had he not written these letters. In fact, we'd probably know nothing about him. If he didn't write these 7, or if you hold a position he wrote 3, regardless of the number, if he didn't write those, no one would even know who he was. A lot of Christians were taken to the martyrdom, but because he was a bishop in Antioch, he was given a execution similar to what we see at that time of the Trajan Empire. This becomes a discussion about him as a person because nothing was known about him before that. There's a lot of theories, legend, that his name comes from that he is born up by God, like he's God bearer, this idea of being held by God, which goes back to he was the little child that Jesus picked up and talked to his disciples and gave a lecture to them about this little child here. If you don't receive as a little child, you won't have the kingdom. That whole teaching of Jesus with little children comes from like this legend that child was Ignatius. I certainly don't think that's the case. I don't believe that at all. But there's legend even about his name, like his name in his letters being represented through this God bearer guy. And so there's a lot of secondary, I would call, myth and legend attached to our character, but I don't think there's a reason to dispute his martyrdom because we have primary sources and companions talking about it, and we have early records like the martyrdom of Ignatius, and then we have early reference to it by other Christian writers going to Irenaeus, who seems to know about Irenaeus, who talks about him, not specifically by name, but then references his letter. So it's interesting that even Origen and others seem to know who this figure is and speak of him as a martyr. There's really no reason to dispute it. We have too much evidence to affirm it. The question is when, how many letters did he write going to his martyrdom? What type of animal actually killed him? How long it took for him to be killed in the Colosseum? Those things are debatable. To me, a man being dragged to Rome to be executed in the Colosseum is pretty well substantiated, as his companions say.
What do you make of the argument from some scholars like Purvo to try to move the epistles much later in time in the Hadrianic era?
Yeah, the Hadrianic era to me, and I get their point. They've attempted to try to bring some middle ground to, like, okay, you got Trajan on one hand, you've got on the other theory. I mean, you understand, you got guys like Jolly and Hubner, who tried to put it during even later. I mean, later than Hadrian. And to me, that's absurd. Like we have earlier references to those letters than the dates being ascribed to them. So some would say, okay, this is somewhere between 117 and 138 because Hadrian was reigning between that year 117 and 138. Now, I will say this, Jacob, if if we're going to allege a Hadrian date on it, as some have tried, I would put it closer to the 117. It would have been very early. That's why I said, like, I kind of have this window between 107 and 117. And it's possible that Hadrian, maybe the big dispute here is that it was right at the transition from 117. I don't know, but I really don't think it's even that late. I think it's closer to the in between that. But this is where Stewart and others try to situate his martyrdom because that's the time frame. But now he's suggesting this idea, and a lot of them suggest it because of the details that are surrounding his being arrested and his travel to Rome, because they would have said that, the details of the unusual route is taking across Asia. It's not normal. So it seems like his escorts are a major part of how people try to date this. And that Stewart looks at it and points to Ignatius's reference of the guards. He calls them leopards, right? I mean, he's like, all right, I'm going to go be eaten by these animals, but I'm already with them now. He says that in his epistle to the Romans, chapter 5. And so he's like, I already have these guards and they're calling them leopards. And so Stewart will argue that this could be something where the Roman cohorts mention names for these types of guards. So like when Ignatius says leopards, he's not speaking metaphorically of the soon to be eating he's going to partake in the Colosseum. Like, I'm already in that mode now. It's more of, no, that's actually what they called these people around that time with Hadrian. So there's a lot of ways that they try to look into the Hadrian timeline. Again, Malalas has it closer to the earthquake around the year 115, somewhere between 112, 115. I lean more there than I do with Hadrian, but I understand that the reason people try to put it into Hadrian is kind of balancing Hubner and Jolly with the late date and then the early date as far as Eusebius goes. And so they're like, okay, it may be somewhere in the middle. And one of the biggest keys is, how do you date Polycarp's letter to the Philippians, right? Because in Polycarp's letter, he references this martyrdom and he references letters that were sent from Ignatius. So if Polycarp's letter to the Philippians is, say, between 135, 150, that takes a whole new meaning to when you date this. If it's during Hadrian, that would be that it had to be somewhere at the end of Hadrian because the correspondence of that. But there's some people that even dispute the last part he mentioned, not the first part, but the second part he mentions in the writing to Philippians about Ignatius, whether or not it's an interpolation. I know that my friend Jack Bull says he really doesn't have a lot of evidence to say it is, but he just has this feeling that it is. And because it seems weird and almost repetitive and out of place. I mean, it wouldn't shock me if it was authentic. The writers of that time did this kind of thing all the time, so it wouldn't surprise me. But at the same time, it doesn't shock me either if it was an interpolation. Even with it being an interpolation, it doesn't change the trajectory that we have to look somewhere between the time of Trajan and Hadrian. There's no later than that. I think personally, Jolly and Hubner have lost their minds when they've come to date this. It's too far out of reality. It has to be between Trajan and Hadrian for it to be fitting to the other framework that's set up specifically with Polycarp's letter, which is a big point of how to date this.
What are the problems with the claims that the short recension came first that you've noticed?
As far as why the short, in the sense of the Syriac short recension?
Yes.
So let me give some positives to the argument. The short recension has the earliest attestation. When it appears at first, when people start quoting, say, the earliest testaments of the writings, it seems to always be Romans, his letter to Polycarp, or possibly even the Church of Ephesus. So by that, it's easy to see that these are the most popular of the letters, as opposed to, say, like the Magnesians. These are more popular. The Smyrnans is popular. And I have an argument for it being early because they now have a fragmented section of the Smyrnans that is older than the Syriac recensions that we have from the short. because that was one of my biggest arguments against my friend Jack, is that yes, the Syriac has the earliest attestation, but there is a section of the writings to the Smyrnans in Greek, which is a part of the middle recension corpus, not the short recension corpus. So date alone of manuscripts cannot make the full argument. But it does appear that the Polycarp letter, the Ephesian letter, and the Romans letter are the most significant early on and quoted. So that makes for the argument itself. So the theory is that there's only 3 of those letters and that they were proposed specifically by Curiton. Curiton really came into play and he found these and he got excited. I mean, he was really happy that he found these manuscripts and he was finally able to do some sort of transcripts of them. And then he was able to translate them. And so he started defending that these are the actually earliest representations, most authentic, and the rest are doing redactive work and interpolation, and that he gives grammatical reasons. And Jack really took that to task in his dissertation, which I hope to be released really soon. I actually reference it and quote it at certain points in my writing as forthcoming, because it's not publicly released yet, but he did let me at least take sections and credit him in it by stating it was forthcoming. But Jack went through great depths, and I hope people will have a chance to read it. I think you'll really enjoy the amount of work he did. One of the biggest arguments I made to him is that we're comparing in some places apples to oranges, because Syriac and Greek are not really brother-sister language. I mean, Coptic and Greek are much closer than what we see in a lot of the Syriac writings. So they're not really brother-sister languages. So trying to compare syntax, grammatical structure, vocab is really different when you're looking at Greek, say from Syriac. So at certain points with conjunctions and how you use those, because like in Greek, you know, some writers are really big on using de as opposed to kai. So we see this even between the Gospels. Some favor the de conjunction of but also, as opposed to constantly using kai, and, like Mark, for example. And so when we start looking at the conjunctions and start doing textual analysis between Syriac and Greek, in my opinion, there's a lot of guessing that has to go into that, because at the end of the day, they are very different. And we're assuming what one scribe or maybe a group of monks who created the Syriac tradition, what way they went. Did they predominantly take de and make it this, or kai and make it that, or keep it the same, take both and make it the same in Syriac? There's a lot of assuming that has to go into that. And because of that, I'm leery of the grammatical fact checking. But there are significant words that Jack pulls out that make you at least pause and go, there is reasonable cause to question the middle recension as being later developed in some ways. Now, it wouldn't surprise me even if the Greek middle recension we have is some form of redacted. Even if Polycarp himself did it, he was entrusted with the letters. It could be that Polycarp added some redactions to endings or introductions, or introduces Ignatius a certain way. That wouldn't shock me at all. And honestly, it doesn't bother me at all. But we see these other guys that defend, even guys like Bunsen and Lipsius in the 19th century. They started defending the short recension way before Curiton got into some of the major, popularity that he has today. But, you know, some of these guys ended up retracting, like Lipsius, for example. He went back and changed his mind and said, you know, the more I think about it, the middle recension is the better in the writings. But it should be noted that Curiton's position faced a lot of resistance at the time. And he did not get well-received applause from the crowd. He was actually quite criticized. And in some ways, I think rightfully so. I think he was a little too innovative at the time. I think that his work has been the beginning stages of something better. I think guys specifically that are working on it now are doing much better arguing for it than even he did. Now, I know that they would like, how dare you say that about Curiton? But I think that other guys, and again, when Jack's work releases, I think is just as good and makes better cases for it than even Curiton. And maybe Curiton just didn't have time to do the analysis the way that maybe Jack's going into it. But these guys took excruciating criticism from their peers at the time, and now it's getting a resurgence, and contemporary guys are actually publishing on it. And now it's creating a new conversation, which again, I'm not against. I think it's good. I still think there is no reason to reject the middle recension for other causes. But in response to the debates that went on with Curitan, he published his defense in, I think it was 1840s. And so he's fighting for this. Others are picking it up. Now you got guys in the modern time who are making great conversation for it. He was just a little bit, he lived about 100 years too early as it relates to making his case more prolific. And so it's unfortunate for him, but his work has been resurrected in some senses, and guys like Jack are doing a good job.
If the middle recension were to turn out to be a redaction of the short recension, would that cause the middle recension to be Hadrianic or later?
I think it would influence it. It would probably mean something like this. It's a good question, Jacob. It would mean that what we have could be from an earlier period. So possibility number one, it did come from Trajan. Jack would even argue that by the time of the end of the 2nd century with Irenaeus of Lyons, that the 7 letters were already circulating by the end of the 2nd century. So in one sense, it could be that the 3 short recensions are the true 3 letters during Trajan, and the redactions happened during Hadrian. And that the 7 letters, not just the redactions from the 3, but 4 new letters were made into, and it could be that companions of Ignatius did it. It's not like the other 4, like the Magnesians or the Smyrnans are sitting around and somebody says, let's fake some sort of thing here. Now, we know deacons and others were sent to Ignatius in his travels. We know that they had some sort of aid coming across the transmission between letter to church, church to bishop, bishop back to church, church back to Ignatius. There's a lot of moving parts in this travel. So he had companions that were there for his story, there for his martyrdom, there for his letters, there who were bringing people to and from the churches to greet him and encourage him and change letters for him. So it could be that he wrote 3 and that friends of his continued to tell his story and some of his sermons or some of his remarks and put those to letter form as well. And so that the redaction happened of the original 3 by expanding them and then adding 4 more that kind of celebrate his life. And his friends and companions wanted his story to be told fuller because he had a message verbally for these churches that just never made it to writing. That's a possibility. The second possibility could be maybe what your question is aimed at. If the middle recension is false and the short recension is true, when would that have happened? Would it lead more to an Hadrian? I actually don't think it would. I think the only way Hadrian makes sense is in my first premise. I don't agree with that first premise, but to me, if I was going to jump on the bandwagon of the short recension priority, I would land with that the events happened in Trajan and that these works were preserved, redacted, and expanded during a time of Hadrian where they circulated full force by the time Irenaeus of Lyons looks back on these, as well as Origen. So there were definitely 7 by the end of the 2nd century. And if there was revision, redaction, and things like that, it would have been in the middle of the 2nd century during Hadrian's reign for that to have happened, in my opinion. Not as much where Jolly and Hubner put it, because that's too late and it wouldn't have been fully circulated at that time because they're putting it later, almost to the time of Irenaeus. And I can't see that being a plausible argument for it. So that would be my issue, is which premise is most likely true. I think it's premise 1. I think it's hypothesis number 1.
And what would you say are the major points of evidence that really shows that the middle recension is probably earlier than the short recension. Maybe some of the bigger points that you haven't mentioned yet.
Yeah. So again, the argument goes to the short recension has fewer letters and less content overall. What's more likely for a scribe, to add or subtract? Well, I mean, on a general note, it would be to add than to subtract. But that's not always true either. And this is something that I looked into as well, because there are issues with the short recension, and I argue for abridgement. So if you look at these things, I think the short recension is an abridgment of the middle recension, with major sections that are completely significant to theological arguments and things like that. Because people say, well, look at all the extra theology in the middle recension. There's less theology in the short. So somebody could be prone to go, well, look at the expansion. Or we can look at the scribe. So in my argument, the language of the short recension has been simplified when you look at it side by side with the middle recension. And so those features strongly suggest that the short recension is not an earlier or more primitive form, but rather an abridgment. And I want to talk about that. And I'm glad you asked that question, because I want to go into this a little bit. Whoever these monks were working at a monastery in this letter, I've thought about this over and over and over again. At what point would a scribe eliminate the theological in order to focus on the story narrative? Because it seems like all the theology, not all, but a lot of the theology has been just drained and wrung out of the short recension. And it just focuses on the man. Now, if there's no need for Syriac monks to push an agenda on theology that's already accepted by the churches, a high view of Christology, a high view of Eucharist, a high view of the bishopric, that's just redundant information. If a monk was trying in this monastery to put together a manuscript that can be for storytelling of the life and martyrdom and death of Polycarp in his travels and focus on the destination, it's kind of like Acts. The book of Acts, although I would argue there's a lot of theology in the book of Acts, but when you get to the second half on the Pauline travels, the theology is less. Not that it's not there, but it's less because it's more narrative. It's more historical. Paul went to this trial on his way, shipwreck, bit by a snake, running into these people, having conversations, staying at this person's house. It's more just like, this is what happened. This is Paul's travel on his way to Rome. It's less theology, more storyline. So it doesn't mean that the theology didn't exist, because you can just go to Paul's letters and find the theology. It could be that the monk in the Syriac monastery who created these documents was solely focusing on the narration, the story about the man, rather than the theology that everybody already agrees with. So I make a strong, evident case for the authenticity of the middle recension, and Paul Foster is a big help on this. Although he takes a later date than I do, he still argues for the middle recension. So that might go back to answering your question as well. He would argue that the middle recension makes more sense for the Hadrian time period, as all of this happening during Hadrian's reign. But one of the key pieces of evidence that Foster highlights is Papyrus 10,581. And when you look at that papyrus, it is dated earlier than the Syriac. It is really the first witness of the middle recension that we have. Now, why is that important? Because it's dated to around the year 500. Some would say that it is anywhere from 500 to 550. Now, that sounds late, given that we're talking about a 2nd century figure, but keep in mind, nothing earlier than that. We have 6th and 7th century after that. And then most of what we have of Ignatius is really 11th, 12th century. the main manuscript that I worked on, which is the long recension that's in the Jerusalem manuscript, Codex H, it's 11th century. And we know that because the scribe dates it and names himself. He calls himself Leo, the sinner, Leo the sinner. And he dates his writing right into the 11th century. And it's not even the short or the middle. It's a long recension with far more letters. This letter to a Mary, not to be confused with Mary, the mother of Jesus, but rather whoever this Casabala Mary lady is, we really don't know. There's correspondence there. There's additional letters. So it has a long recension. So even when it covers Ephesians or it covers Romans, it's got longer readings even in those letters that are in the short recension. So what we're looking for is like, so that's late. What's the earliest? Syriac. Well, that's great. But now we also have something earlier than that. We have a 4th century manuscript that is covering the letter of Smyrna, which is not in the short recension. So to say, but again, Jack and others will argue back. So, well, don't forget, Stephen, we believe that the seven letters were circulated and normalized by Irenaeus. So of course there's going to be 4th century. Right. But this is a major discussion point because one of the primary source arguments against the middle recension for the short is the dating of early representation. Well, now that we have a 4th century manuscript that reads quite a few verses of the middle recension, specifically covering the Smyrnans, there's really nothing to panic about here as it relates to, well, who has the earliest attestation? There's another argument, and Foster argues this argument as well, that the long recension shows signs of theological development. The same thing that the short recension advocates argue against the middle recension advocates. Like, oh, there's theological development. I would say that the middle recension isn't developing theology, but including a lot of theology, because you could still find the basic form of that theology in the short recension, but it's just not elaborated, pious, and all the extra. Again, I think that extra is eliminated from a scribe who's writing a document just to be narrative, to tell a narration, of the story of Ignatius to people in the monastery. But if you're looking at it from the long recension, you start looking at things like development. But the long recension has like theological things that weren't even disputed till the Middle Ages. And it's easy to date those because it's like, wow, like not only does anybody quote from the long recension up to the Middle Ages, the theology it is dealing with is Middle Age theology. That can't be said between the short and the middle. The very theology we find in the short and middle recension can be traced within that 2nd century period through other writings. And that makes it a little bit easier. But I think Foster presents a strong case for the middle recension, and anybody can read his work. And there's lots of free copies online about it. But in the original language, I think that what we're dealing with is not a redaction, but an abridgement from a specific scribe. The one thing that I told Jack would convince me of the short recension is if there were Greek manuscripts that only cover the short recension, exactly how we see in the Syriac. The problem is where we're dealing with one scribe or one group of scribes from the same monastery for all of the witnesses of that short recension. So we don't know their motive. If we have a secondary evidence, a second witness that comes in, and it is doing the same thing, now we can make the argument that those were already circulating in that form. But because it's only one group, we're independently working off of one assumption. But I also think the patristics give us a middle recension support too. So again, as I've been saying over and over again, Irenaeus directly cites Ignatius's notorious line that says, and he goes on to say, as one of ours said, when he was condemned to the beast for bearing witness to God, I am wheat of Christ. I am grounded by the teeth of the beast, that I may be found a pure bread of God, which he's quoting Romans 4. But the quote is notably without Ignatius's name. He just says specifically, one of ours said while being condemned. And then obviously we know who he's quoting. It's interesting it doesn't mention who it is. But remember the late date Jolly guy, he argues that this omission makes sense since Irenaeus had studied under Polycarp, he would have never known that letter was attributed to Ignatius of Antioch, which I think is ridiculous. But nonetheless, I mean, I just don't have a lot of respect for Robert Jolly's research on this, but nonetheless, that's his argument. So it is important to recognize that Irenaeus references early Christian teachers all the time anonymously. It's not like, oh, this is the first time Irenaeus quoted somebody and didn't tell us who it was. I mean, that's not unusual. He did it in book 5 quite a bit and against heresies. So, I mean, it's not a shock that he would do it here either. Again, Ignatius is more popularized by us than it is by them. I'm not saying he wasn't important. I'm saying that he wasn't like a prolific guy in the way that we have made it in academia debates today. Yes, he was important. Antioch was not as big of a deal as some of these other churches as they were expanding in the East, as well as West, especially in North Africa, building traction, especially from Alexandria and definitely in Rome and Constantinople and that region in Ephesus. These become the more prolific trade ports. Antioch is kind of a small church compared to the rest. So I'm not saying his story's unimportant, but he wasn't like, oh my gosh, everybody knows this guy. So it wouldn't have been as important for Irenaeus to mention him. But we do see his writings in the middle form recension coming up more and more. So Origen, for example, in his commentary on the Song of Solomon, he explicitly names Ignatius and he quotes Romans 7:2, where he says, I remember that one of the saints with the name Ignatius said concerning Christ, my love is crucified. Now, there's a lot there from Holmes and Lightfoot. I made a huge case through Charles Williams, where he deals with the word eros, love, the form that he uses here, because he doesn't. There's a lot of argument in this because he says, my love is crucified, or my passionate love has been crucified. It just depends on how you're reading it. If the original term was agape, that would be one thing. But it's interesting. The argument is readings are or should be eros here. And that would be odd because a lot of times eros is used in a sexual love way. Not always, but that's where Williams makes a really good argument that we've made it too narrow. And that it needs to be looked at from a theological perspective as well. And I make a huge argument using some of what Charles Williams dealt with. And for the sake of time, Jacob, I would encourage your readers and listeners to go in and click the link and read this part. I think it's on page 16, 17 area, because I wrote a lot on that. But it's very clear to me that the way Origen and Irenaeus are quoting these sections and others as well, they're definitely working with, in my opinion, the middle recension. Jonathan Lucadou, who is one of the best Ignatian scholars alive. Jonathan Lucadou is phenomenal. You can find a lot of his works all over the internet. He has books on this. He defends a middle recension, kind of a Malalas date as well, but he's very, very balanced on this. He has defended some of these readings as well. Guys like Stander and Lucadou, they're really good. And so I would encourage anybody to read this. No doubt Eusebius was using a middle recension. And there's others that you can go through my article and you can read all these different things where I discuss the middle recension being used by patristics and church fathers. It's clear that the middle recension was the standard from Irenaeus forward.
For my final question, so basically what you're saying is that the early church fathers, even though they're not, some of them are not explicitly mentioning the 7 letters, you said the short recension was mentioned earliest, but they're quoting they're quoting verses that only came from the middle recension,
or lines. Like they could be argued because it's Romans in some places or Ephesians, which are in the short recension and middle. But how they're quoting it, it could be the difference between one word. Now, back to something I said about Origen real quick. We got to remember what's preserved of Origen was not from himself. And we have a difference between Latin and Greek that now comes into play too. This is why I say this becomes a difficult discussion when we're looking at the language barriers between the manuscripts, transmission of those manuscripts, comparisons of language. But it seems like to me, and the argument I make is that the form that Origen was quoting was a middle recension form that's been preserved for us. And it might be the difference between one word or the way a word is used as opposed to others. And that really helps see which form, because the middle and the short all have Ephesians, Polycarp, and Romans. And it seems like they all like to quote those the most, which is in favor of their argument. But why is it that it seems like it's closer to the middle recension form? Even if it's one word difference, it's patterning itself after that middle recension reform over against the short. It seems interesting. And then there's really no dispute by the time you get to Eusebius, he's clearly using the middle recension as the standard. And by the way, I make an argument in the paper that Eusebius has the letters that he is looking at are the exact letters that Origen had, and that he inherited some of Origen's writings in the library. Now, I make an argument for that in the paper. I would encourage your listeners to go back and listen to that. But I think it's a fun discussion. I enjoy this discussion because there's so many rabbit holes you could go down and start having interesting dialogue. It's not worth like being mad about. It's not worth being dogmatic about, because there's a lot of open discussion that makes it fun to like travel through time and work through it and what could have happened, what may have happened here and there. I like that part about the study in of itself.
We have a couple of super chat questions. I want to take those real quick before we close. Solar Knight, thank you for your super chat. In the flesh means a totally natural human being, which should supersede all half-man, half-God conjectures, attempts at deification of the Roman emperor as holy God-man Christ.
So we don't believe as Christians, especially Nicene Christians, that God is half man, half God. Like we don't hold to Nestorianism or other forms of heresies that arose in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries. We believe in the hypostatic union, greatly defended by two main figures, Cyril of Alexandria, number one, who seemed to really coin the idea of hypostatic union at the Council of Ephesus in 431. Also, a major proponent of that was Athanasius, and there's a whole creed named after him explaining this. But again, to say that whether you agree with me or not it's not the point. To say that that's what we believe, and you explicitly put Rome on that. Rome doesn't believe in a half man, half God. So I don't know. Can you pull the question back up? I want to make sure I'm answering both parts. It just needed to be clarified. The Roman belief or idea by the time the standard comes was not half man, half God idea. That was considered heresy. So in the flesh means a totally natural being should supersede all the other things. It does not, because in the writing to Romans, specifically, Ignatius not only called him a man, he called him God. He called Jesus God in two places, if you believe in the middle recension. If you hold to the short recension, he says it in one. If you hold to the middle recension, he explicitly calls Jesus God in two. So he did believe he was a man, and he did believe he was God. He didn't do this half and half idea. And the church later declared that it wasn't a half or partial, mostly little. It was fully God, fully man in the hypostatic union as defined by Cyril of Jerusalem, the Council of Ephesus.
And we have another super chat. Fish and Tie, thank you for your super chat. I am researching the Nazorians around Pella. I am finding menorahs inscribed next to crosses. How late would these be dated, i.e. parting of the ways?
I don't know the dates. It's a good question, but it's very interesting how the Jewish tradition was alongside the Christian tradition very, very early on. A lot of that was due to James of Jerusalem, for example. When Constantine's mother did her travels and studies, she preserved a lot of the Jewish Christian ideas that were very early on. Of course, they say in Rome they have a lot of early artifacts that belong to the family of Jesus or items associated with Jesus. But finding Jews with like menorahs or crosses or inscriptions is not a surprise. I mean, they excavated certain things in Galilee recently with the inscription of Andrew, probably Andrew, definitely Peter, but possibly Andrew, maybe where one of the early house churches was in Galilee, or at least designated to Peter and Andrew in Galilee, where their hometown was. So it wouldn't surprise me if they're 2nd century or late 1st century. I don't know the date. I don't want to give a date because I haven't like looked at it archaeologically or read the research on it, but I doubt it's any earlier, obviously, than Christianity. And it probably was when Christianity really found its home in the Jewish communities, which was prolifically done by James of Jerusalem, James the Just. Even Josephus refers to these Christian communities meeting around the temple. James being one of their leaders who was killed by the high priest. And by the high priest, he lost his position as a result of that because he did an execution without the permission of Rome. And so he lost his high priest position before the destruction of Jerusalem in the early 60s. So even Josephus recognized Christian communities that were circulating Jerusalem, especially around the temple. So to see those two things integrated would not be a shock at all.
And like I said at the beginning of the show, Stephen Boyce's YouTube channel, tagged in the description below, and a pinned comment to the Facts podcast. And I also have a link to his paper on Ignatius in the description below and a pinned comment for those that want to go read it. Solar Night managed to put in one more super chat right before I was about to end the show. So thank you for the super chat. Who invented the hypostatic union idea and why? I don't know if you want to this.
Well, we wouldn't say that they invented the idea. They invented the term. It seems like Cyril of Alexandria coined the term to say that it's kind of like the teaching existed, but how to rightly term it was an issue in a lot of things for the church. Like, for example, they all taught that the Eucharist, the bread and the wine that was being offered at these gatherings, was the body and blood of Christ. They didn't have the term consubstantiation, transubstantiation. They didn't have terms like that. Really, till the Nicene point, we do see that they consubstantial with the Father and the Creed, so they at least had it by that point. But it seems like the church was looking how to describe something that already existed. So when they come up with the idea of a hypostatic union, they're not inventing the hypostatic union. They're trying to put a term to what was already believed. And in this case, I think that they believed that Jesus was fully God, fully man. They just did not have the semantical term for it. But I think where we start really seeing it used would be Cyril of Alexandria, particularly in the church, in the Council of Ephesus in the 430s.
All right, so that was the last super chat. That being said, Stephen, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.